Thank you very much. And I got to tell you, I'm going to need a minute to just calm down here because Armando's presentation scared the hell out of me. Really, it's just amazing to see, how these things take place and what we need to be aware of. As was mentioned, Peter Levesque, President of Ports America. I want to give you a little bit of domestic and international kind of perspective because I did spend the last 25 years living and working in the Asia-Pacific region, based in Hong Kong, dealing with China. I also want to give you some perspective from where we are at Ports America, mainly because we do operate at 33 ports around the United States, Tampa, of course, being one of them. And there's a lot going on, not only with cyber, but with the rest of supply chain resilience. And really, what better topic today to talk about in terms of resilience, including cyber, than everything else that we have going on here. So if we go to the next slide. Do you guys have it or do I? Okay, great. I want to give you some examples first of what we've experienced, not only overseas, but here at home. I'll give you a few different scenarios here that we need to understand. First one, I think that is critical, especially around COVID, is something called the Wuhan effect. Prior to COVID, in the Wuhan province, there were 50,000 tier 1 suppliers, okay? Companies making final products. There were 5 million tier 2 suppliers. Those are suppliers that are making component parts to go to a tier 1 supplier. So when Wuhan shut down with COVID, and then China shut down after Wuhan shut down, retailers and importers here in the United States had an oh my God moment, because many realized for the very first time how many sourcing eggs they had in one basket, right? And that drove this migration, diversification of sourcing from China to places like Southeast Asia, India, Latin America, and Mexico. Okay? And that is a trend that's going to continue to happen on the positive side because we've realized we cannot have all our sourcing eggs in one basket. We need to diversify. The second one I call the pencil and paper scenario because, as was mentioned in the previous presentation, in Hong Kong, we lived the Maersk ransomware attack in real life. All of a sudden, we have 18,000, 23,000 TEU ships coming into the port of Hong Kong, into our port. And all of a sudden, we can't use our terminal operating system. No computer systems whatsoever. Not only that, but we can't communicate with Maersk because we can't use email. We could sort of use phones, but who do you call? Now, at Modern Terminals in Hong Kong, we had prided ourselves in the fact that we had all these contingency plans ready for if we got hacked. The fact is, we had no contingency plan for what happens if our customers get hacked. So what do? 18,000 TEU ships are coming in, one after the other. You have no computer system. Well, fortunately, we had employees at Modern Terminals in Hong Kong who had been employees for 40 years. They remember what it was like to work a ship before there were computer systems. And they literally worked these multi-thousand TEU ships with pencil and paper. Now, we were lucky. And a lot of the contingency planning that's going on now really has to do with, what to do in case, not preventing, but what happens, what do you do after something happens? That pencil and paper scenario was pretty significant. And I encourage all of you to think about that as well. The third example just happened maybe 6 months ago with one of our largest customers. We got the dreaded phone call. Did you guys receive our wire transfer? I said, well, what wire transfer? They said, well, we just sent you a $1.3 million wire transfer to a bank that we don't recognize. We've never used that bank with you before. Now, at Ports America, we've spent the last 2 years in intense training of our people on how to recognize when weird things are going on in your email, right? And it was fascinating to see the email string from this major company and the conversations that were taking place internally about, well, we've never seen that bank account before, and all kinds of questions that were coming out in this email string, and nobody thought to give us a call before they made the wire transfer. Right? So it was a big wake-up call that A, we're doing the right things by providing this training to our people to make sure that they understand what this looks like, but B, it was a wake-up call that, wow, Somebody just got $1.3 million on an email and a fake invoice from Ports America and a fake email address. The email address even looks screwed up. So, that kind of drove home with a lot of our people about how real this is and why the training is so important. The other issue that we face now is very much geopolitical. You look at what's going on around the world, it's like 80% of traded goods that are going on right now are going between countries whose political stability is in decline. Right? There's some scary places out there. And when I look at it, again, from the Asia Pacific perspective, I think of the South China Sea. $5 trillion worth of goods flow through the South China Sea every year. That's a lot. And just in the beginning of October, China flew 149 sorties into Taiwan's ADIZ, their Air Defense Identification Zone. 149. Working with the Navy a lot while in the Asia Pacific, I can tell you that what the Navy would say, and if there's any Navy people here today, what they fear most isn't so much something that happens on purpose. It's the accident. It's the two ships that go bump in the night, or the two planes that go bump in the night, and because of a lack of communication, it escalates into, all out whatever. But $5 trillion worth of our stuff going through the South China Sea, can you imagine the interruption to supply chain resilience if people start firing at each other in that zone? The tensions, I think, are higher than we realize, and it's just something, again, that we need to be aware of. The other component to this on supply chain resilience is environment. We had 5 hurricanes hit the port of New Orleans in 2020 in addition to COVID. 5. And they weren't small ones. So weather is really having an impact and will continue to have an impact. And it's something that in supply chain, in terms of designing supply chains, we need to be aware of and that we need to plan for. I mentioned here the Syrian conflict. The Syrian uprising that started in 2011 actually began with one of the most serious droughts that Syria had ever faced from 2007 to 2010. The result of that drought was that 1.5 million farmers and their families moved to the cities, on top of another 1.5 million people, refugees from Iraq, that had moved into Syria. So you had unrest, you had squalor, you had crime, you had unemployment, you had the recipe for unrest. And so you could say, in one manner of fact, that water crisis actually created, in many parts, the Syrian conflict, which has now gone on for a decade. We go to the next slide. McKinsey did a really interesting study on supply chain resilience in August of 2020. I call this the 4 quadrants of doom, because there's nothing good on this. There's unanticipated catastrophes, there's foreseeable catastrophes, but they're catastrophes nonetheless, including meteor strike. I think we have enough to worry about, but it's on there. But the interesting part of this is the fact that we do need to think in these quadrants and be able to, when we're planning our supply chains, or if we're service providers, when we're providing services in the supply chain, we do need to have these things in mind around what Sheffy from MIT would call low probability, high impact type events. The most interesting part that came out of the study, though, was we can fully expect that supply chain disruptions that last 2 or more months are going to happen now about every 3.7 years. So you think about 9/11, or you think about the global financial crisis, or weather, or cyber, all these things. The prediction is that we're going to see more disruption more often. And disruption that lasts 2 months or more is actually going to average now around every 5 years. That's not a whole lot of time. All right? We've been lucky here in the US that we've gone through these things, and the American consumer has remained resilient, really resilient. So we go through our adjustment period, and then we come right back. But these are a lot of things to consider, and it should be part of any logistics supply chain planning process. We go to the next slide. So if you want to see what supply chain resilience should not look like, look at LA Long Beach, right? It's a mess. Even today, there's still 60 ships sitting off there, and it's just a complete bottleneck. And it's because, A, we weren't prepared for a pandemic. B, we were not prepared for a rapid acceleration in e-commerce, okay? And C, we weren't prepared for this shift in sourcing from Southeast Asia to from China to places like Southeast Asia, India, Mexico, and Latin America. All these shifts came into play, and e-commerce being probably the biggest one, because we all stayed home, we all had access to the internet, we all bought, and it really just exacerbated the entire situation with product coming in. And from an LA Long Beach perspective, from a supplier perspective, LA Long Beach always looks like the fastest place in. As I mentioned, US consumer continues to remain resilient. Wages recovered, and in many cases they over-recovered. So when we look at what's going to happen on the supply chain in terms of this whole thing being cleaned up, I don't give it 90 days. It's really looking like it's going to be, fourth quarter of 2022 before we get the supply chain back in balance. The first 7 months of 2021, we had a 27% increase in Asia to the United States cargo. Door-to-door transit from Asia to the United States went from 41 days to 71 days. And the idea of buffer stock, this idea of more inventory closer to consumers, that's something that's very real. In fact, we looked at a study that said because of e-commerce and because of this shift and because of retailers' need to keep more inventory just in case, that's going to equate to a 5% increase in overall inventory by retailers in the US. That 5% increase is about 15 million TEUs of additional throughput coming into the US, and that volume would take 470 million square feet of additional warehouse space just to handle. So you look at what's off the West Coast, you're not going to build 470 million square feet of warehouse space, tomorrow. This is something that's going to have to work itself out. And then there's the diversification of risk that's going on here in the US, which is great news for Port Tampa. We know that retailers and importers, their supply chain strategy teams are sitting in conference rooms right now trying to figure out how not to go to LA Long Beach. They're trying to figure out, how do we use ports like Tampa? How do we maximize locations like this to be able to distribute around the United States? So this is great news, because those ships shouldn't be piled up all in one place, all right? There's ports all over the US, and ports like Tampa are really going to benefit from this whole situation. Can we go to the next slide? So just to kind of wrap up here, I think it's important we understand prevention versus continuity. As was mentioned before, you're never going to stay ahead of the bad guys. All right? We spend a lot of time at Ports America doing everything we can on the prevention side, most of which is education, but a lot of it is the tech stuff that goes in to securing your networks. But we're spending just as much time now, if not more time, on continuity. What happens when the system goes down? How quickly can you get back up and running? It's a business issue, it's a competitive issue, okay? And it's something that is much more tangible to be able to address than this world of, my God, what could they do next? All right, that's something that you're just throwing darts at, as opposed to, okay, well, when the system goes down, here's how we operate. The second thing is, back to that 4 quadrants of doom, is doing some planning around low probability, high impact events. You never know, okay, but it should be part of the planning. The third thing is, again, back to McKinsey, expect more disruption more often. It's just going to become a way of life. We're just going to, as consumers and as business people, we're just going to have to roll with it. And then there's the lessons from COVID itself in terms of supply chain resilience. And that is, we realized how much PPE and how much pharma, how many chips are made in China. The light bulb went off, okay? And from a US national security perspective and supply chain perspective, This is good news, okay? The fact that we've realized it means that we can fix it by either nearshoring or onshoring some of these critical components and critical materials. We have sourcing risk, all right? These countries that we source from, you can't put all the sourcing eggs in one basket. We have labor risk. Now, you know, COVID impacted labor, and it was a big deal. A, because it scared everybody to death, as it should have, and B, we had a lot of people get sick. And yet we still, you know, had to keep the ports going. So there needs to be some planning around communication and how you address that. And then capacity and inventory risk. You know, you can keep the ports open 24/7, and that's a huge step, but the trucks and the trains and the warehouses, it all fits together, as everybody in this room knows. So it needs to be a holistic approach to fixing the problem, in addition to keeping the ports open. And that's something that we're all going to have to work on. Finally, I'll say the good news is that we should emerge from this crisis, this pandemic, more prepared than we ever have been for a resilient supply chain. In 2003, I was in Hong Kong for SARS. SARS was, as everybody probably remembers, I mean, it was just this crazy thing that came out of nowhere. It panicked everybody. Nobody knew what to do. People were dying. But the good news is when COVID came back, when COVID got into Hong Kong this time, everybody knew what to do. The masks came out, nobody had to say anything. The separation came out, nobody had to say anything. The places where people gathered shut down. They already knew what to do because SARS was very much like COVID. Right now they've kind of gone a little bit too far in their addressing the issue and how long it takes to get back into Hong Kong. But the fact is that because of the experience of SARS, they came out of it with more experience on what to do with COVID. And I think that we'll see the same thing in the United States and throughout our supply chains, should this happen again, and the probability is that it will. Maybe not COVID, but something like it. Can we go to the next slide? So I'm a bit of a pessimist on how quickly we're going to get this whole thing worked out. And keep in mind, pessimist is really just an optimist with experience. But the economists, I think, had it right. Global supply chains aren't failing, they're adapting. And as a result of what's going on, the supply chains will adapt, and we should be coming out of this much stronger, much more resilient, much more efficient than we ever have been. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much.